So I think in the period we live in, with global capitalism, multinational corporations dominating the system, no one in their right mind should spend too much time explaining to you why we need internationalism. It must be obvious to all. And of course, even capitalists admit that this aspect of globalization, when it was talked about in the early 2000s, Marx was one of the first to predict it. And he actually talked, they don't talk about this, but we know he talked about working class internationalism, which was designed to respond to capitalist globalization. There were two factors two elements that, according to Marx, governed this internationalism. One was the critique of international exploitation and the development of a working class movement that was both national and international, because capitalism was becoming increasingly international. If we look now at the world we live in, we are increasingly seeing this monopolization of capital. I think there are 8 large global capitalist companies that dominate, if you like, the number of employees, the amount of capital they have. They include the obvious ones: Amazon, PetroChina, Apple, Shell, Walmart, and so on. But there are also this new phenomena of the 8 top companies with what we call the top 8 per market capitalization companies. This is the factor calculated by multiplying the number of companies' shares by the current market price of one share. And then we see a different world where the, if you like, internet companies, Apple, Microsoft, Google dominate, and then there's Saudi Arabian oil and Amazon. So you can see how more and more we are seeing a world where, in my opinion, even some of these internet companies will start and buy production companies, car manufacturers, and the labor in all of these will be interconnected. We also know that, for example, although there is talk of lots of brands of car in the world, some produced in South Korea, some produced in Spain, wherever. But in general, there is about, as far as I know, and that's probably a 2016 figure, only 7 or 8 major car manufacturers. All the others are interconnected. For example, Volkswagen owns 4 or 5 brands, BMW owns 4 or 5 other brands. And so if you reduce those and reduce their subsidiaries in various countries, you do go down in numbers. What we have is that the employees of these companies are also international. There is a division of labor in most of these. Labor-intensive, cheaper tasks are performed in third world countries. The products are then moved to what could, in the past, was called second world. Nowadays, East European countries, maybe more advanced Latin American or more advanced North African countries, before the final touches are added in the first world: US, Canada, Western Europe. Wages start very low in the labor-intensive part. They go to middle-range salaries and better in the first world. And ironically, the first world jobs are usually associated with non-productive tasks. Research and development is one aspect of it, but more importantly, in terms of the factory itself, useless tasks such as management, marketing, advertising. I would put IT advertising as part of this, but they are if you like, the money is there. we can see how this global capital affects labor in the early months of the pandemic, when Chinese factories who make electronic circuit boards, not just for iPhones, but also for servers, were shut down. Workers in Hungary who built the servers using these boards had no jobs. They were actually laid off temporarily until China caught up. And of course, the sellers, market experts, promoters, managers were left with the task of explaining why they couldn't sell the goods in US or Western Europe. And we are well aware that this whole policy of globalized capital, globalization, is constantly looking for cheaper labor, especially for time-consuming, more difficult jobs, more labor-intensive jobs. It used to be China, Vietnam was cheaper. Now Africa, apparently some African states are even cheaper. And contrary to claims by idiot nationalists such as Donald Trump, this trend will not change. During the Trump era, if you remember, he wanted to bring jobs back to the US. But the reality is that, and this was reflected in the business programs' responses to Donald Trump's claim, the reality is that a simple item produced in China at $4 or $5 would cost $60 to $70 to the manufacturer in US. And then the seller would have to reduce its margin of profit considerably in order to sell this job. We also know that in addition to this division of the world, which has the, if you like, the heavy working, the labor-intensive working class, the middle section, and this management section, global capital and imperialism, the hegemon power in the global capital system, has in the last, I would say, 18, maybe longer years, made the decisions that war and conflict, mainly as a result of their own direct intervention, such as the war against terror, has made part of our global world, mainly in Middle East and North Africa, a part where war and conflict are making production more expensive, more risky, in some parts because they've added sanctions to it, in some parts because their war has created wonderful creatures such as Islamic State. And they're not even good consumers because their income, because of war, because of forced immigration out of these countries by the middle classes, they're not good consumers. So in a way, that also explained the scorched earth policy of imperialism, global capital towards parts of the Middle East and North Africa. They basically don't matter. Who cares about them? Having given a very rough, negative view of what the world looks like, I have to emphasize that there's nothing new in this. In the 19th century, international exploitation existed, and Marx wrote about it, creating a permanent structural relation of dependency of poor nations on rich nations. And the effect of this on the working class internationally was obvious. Marx, referring to India in 1881, talks of the suppression of communal land ownership, which was, according to him, an act of English vandalism that drove the indigenous population backwards rather than forwards, placing the Indian population in conditions of super exploitation. Marx refers not just to the commodities appropriated by the British, but also what it sent to Great Britain as a total sum of 60 million of agricultural and industrial laborers of India. He refers to it as a bleeding process, leaving the local population facing years of famine. And as we know, that is what happened. So the famous quote, "A nation that enslaves another forgets its own chains," is indeed true, or it was written in the April of the same year about Ireland. He emphasized that the emancipation of Ireland is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of the social emancipation of the British working class. The second condition of internationalism requires a combination of national and international struggle. And this is each as the basis for the other. The first international, where Marx was playing quite an important role, had its roots in the general strike of London workers in 1859. This was in response to a particular economic crisis, 57-58 of the 19th century, and in the effects of the and the trade unionism of that time, but it was also a consequence of the effects of the Great Cotton Famine brought about by the US Civil War, which suddenly confronted the British textile industry with a chronic shortage of supplies. When the Hungarians were complaining about China, I was thinking about that. The worst hardships of which were obviously passed to the working class. About 80% of the raw cotton imported during that period to Britain came from the United States, and the British textile industry was now cut off due to the fact that the northern blockade of the Confederate shipping made it impossible to send these. And full-time employment in Lancashire cotton industry dropped considerably. But what was impressive for Marx was the fact that the English working class in that period, from Manchester to London, was organizing in opposition to the active support that the British state had for the slave South. And they were, the working class was trying to to stop the attempts and the intentions of Palmerston to intervene militarily in the Civil War on the side of the South. This action of the working class was against their immediate economic benefits, their immediate economic interests. And in a letter to Engels, Marx wrote, "This is almost unprecedented in the history," in that the working class is aware that what they're doing might not benefit them, might be against their interest, but yet do so. And that gave him the vision of international workers' solidarity. When he addressed the First International in October of 1864, Marx referred to the actions of the English workers as an example for the need to establish an independent working class foreign policy, which would oppose imperialism, exploitative methods of the capitalist system. And in some ways, even at that period, it showed to Marx that history had taught the working classes the importance of international politics. In some ways, the working class had stopped the reactionary intervention of the European ruling class for the propagation of slavery in the United States. So the call for international proletarian unity wasn't simply an act of a call for workers in one country to support workers in another country. It referred to the basic realities that is everyday capitalist relations, capitalist economic relations, which often try and play one working class against another and continue to do so, as we saw during Brexit, as we see in most of Europe nowadays, but also in the United States, so clearly in recent years. The problem of importing labor to undermine the struggle of workers was a key issue in the development of the international itself, and in many ways it remains so when we talk to comrades across Europe. The 1866 instructions for delegates of the Provisional General Council of the International had one main objective: to counter the intrigues of capitalism in case of strikes and lockouts, and to counter their attempts to misuse foreign workmen as a tool against the native working class. Yet, for all his calls of international solidarity, I think Marx was also very clear that this could only be built on the basis of national working class organization rooted in the material conditions of exploitation in a single context, in a single national context. In the critique of the Goethe program, he wrote that as a class, the working class has its own country as the immediate arena of the struggle. And the movement has to emerge from the immediate material conditions of that country. Then it has to take on global dimensions. If you don't know the details of politics of another country, I don't think you can intervene cleverly or efficiently in the daily struggles of comrades in that country. One example of this, in my opinion, is when the misunderstandings that exist, for example, when we talk of a regional Middle East uprising as part of an international uprising. In that case, we are saying that Palestinians, Jordans, Lebanese, Syrians were part of the same Ottoman Empire until early part of the 20th century, shared the same politics, economics, and the plight of citizens in occupied territory, refugee situation created by Israeli apartheid Zionism, is their, if you like, national struggle. And that struggle is part of an international struggle. So when we talk, otherwise you would have to say that Palestinians as a nation are already divided. The connection between Palestinians in the West Bank with Jordanians and Lebanese, where many refugee Palestinians live, is much closer than with Gaza. So just a brackets here, but to explain why when we talk of that kind of regional struggles, that's what we mean. But in general, I think the struggle, the immediate struggle you know more about is the one where you live and you experience the daily struggles. That doesn't mean, as I will explain towards the end of this talk, that you can be ignorant of struggles elsewhere, or that you do not follow the struggles that go on internationally. In 1889, the Second International was born. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. There has been so many discussions about this, both yesterday and on previous occasions, but generally speaking, the leaders of the social democratic parties and the trade union mass organizations were now aspiring to become reformers in association with existing group ruling classes. Compromise and discussion became part of their daily effort, and the negotiation of differences was involved in terms of compromises. They believed that the steady increase in the standard of living due to the present pressure of their organizations, trade unions, and so on, would continue forever, and they would win the compromises they wished. At the Basel Conference of 1912, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, Luxembourg, Trotsky, a lot of people participated in the first steps towards the Second International as the means for the liberation from the shackles of capitalism. However, by 1914, it was clear that the leaders of social democracy in most of these countries rallied to the support of their own ruling class for the First World War. They had fallen into the trap of making demands for reform from the imperialist bourgeois government and to continue to support it. And indeed, once you supported it, you had to support the wars that these governments were involved in. In my opinion, whatever nuances we can put and whatever academic justification of history we might have, theoretically, this showed a complete collapse into social chauvinism, a complete confusion that in terms of the German social democrats meant the defense of the fatherland. Politically, it was substituting bourgeois nationalism for internationalism, joining reformists and renouncing revolution. The whole Soviet period, which I will refer to in this section, is what I would call internationalism in practice. And it generally was pretty disastrous, more or less. However, having been someone who for many years repeated the Iranian left's complaints about the way the Iranian Revolution and the Gilan Republic was, if you like, betrayed by Lenin even, for the sake of saving the first socialist republic, I'm now more agnostic about the situation. Basically, to cut a very long story short, Iranian socialists following the Bolshevik Revolution had set up a Gilan Republic, a Soviet republic called the Gilan Republic. And there were nationalist elements in this, the Iran Jangali movement led by Kuchek, but there were also Adalat, Sultanzadeh, and the communists. And in some ways, they had pleaded with Lenin to support the Gilan Republic and so on. International politics was moving very fast. The Soviet Union, the first republic, didn't have the support of Germany. And by that stage, there was a civil war going on. White Russians were attacking with the help of Britain in particular. And the Soviet Union, in 1921, the Soviet Union and Britain reached an agreement that basically meant the end of the Russian support for the Gilan Republic. And later, Reza Khan came to power and so on. Now, many Iranians have always said that this was the beginning of the betrayal of internationalism. There is a point in that. However, we have to emphasize 2 points. One is that this was a very small part of a very big country. It was unlikely that it would lead to the working class taking state power. It was very much the Gilan Republic had the elements of Iranian intellectuals who had come back from various European countries. It was never going to be a socialist republic of Iran. And then on the other hand, there was the survival of the Soviet Union. Having said that, I think what people do complain about is that this contradicted the 21 conditions that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had put as prerequisites for groups wanting to join the Comintern and the International. The 21 conditions called for the demarcation between communist parties and socialist groups and instructed the Comintern sections not to trust the legality of bourgeois states. As I said, I'm more agnostic about this than I used to be. After the mid-1920s, the Soviet Union played an important role in building its own allies, at times promoting broad fronts with nationalists for the sake of the interests of the USSR, only to do U-turns and supporting specific groups. And all this cost the lives of tens of thousands of communists, creating confusion, disillusionment, despair at times about socialism and communism. Communists were identified, they organized in trade unions that were associated with their parties, so they were open activists, and then the Soviet Union told them, oh no, we are supporting the nationalist government. So this, in many countries, this led to massacre of large numbers of communist socialists. And the internationalism of the Soviet Union in the 1930s was the politics of the party. There was no discussions, there was no democracies, there was no debate, there was following the rules. In some ways, we are past that stage, in that I think the kind of secrecies that existed in these organizations and these parties in that part of the 20th century will never happen again. But having said that, as we discussed this morning, Dimitrov argued that communist parties should seek popular fronts with parties opposed to fascism or opposed to Western domination, and later told them the exact opposite. And we can't see, although we now know from the memoirs of people who have written about the subject, there were people who thought this was stupid, this was the wrong idea. There was no significant opposition to change this. There was no ability to debate this. The party organization was completely, at that stage, dominated by security services. In France and in Spain, it had consequences with Léon Blanc's 1936 election, which led to the Popular Front government. The 1930s, we see Stalin purges. These affect Comintern activists living in both the Soviet Union and overseas. And quite a lot of these activists are international activists. So there is the divisions between the secret police, the foreign intelligence operatives, informers working under Comintern guides, but at the same time, we have internationalists who are, if you like, writers, labor activists, and so on. We know that, for example, several hundred German communists and anti-fascists who either fled from Nazi Germany or were convinced to relocate in the Soviet Union were liquidated. More than 1,000 were handed back to Nazi Germany. In Europe and in Eastern Europe, thousands of leftists had become active in international politics in this period of what I would call mid-1930s to 1939, 1940. And they were putting their lives at risk in opposition to fascism. Many of them maybe had become active and communist because of their anti-fascism. Many of them were active in countries that wasn't their country of birth. Either the Comintern had sent them or they had volunteered for action in other places. And of course, they were bewildered when Stalin-Hitler Pact was signed in 1939. If you read the memoirs, the writings of some of these people, they just couldn't believe that Stalin had signed this pact. And I know, again, there are millions of excuses, reasons for doing that. But at the end of the day, that really destroyed not just the morale, but put at risk the lives of so many internationalists, so to speak. 1936-39 is also the period of the Spanish Civil War. Everyone I have met from Scandinavia to Britain of that generation told me, because most of them are now dead, told me that that was the best time for internationalism. And these were people who volunteered for the international brigades. And if you think of it, it was very brave. The fascists, the nationalists, the monarchists, from the blue shirts of Ireland to the black shirts of UK, they all went to defend Franco, and the left, the socialists, the Marxists, the anarchists, went to defend the Republic, the Second Spanish Republic. On surface and in terms of what international politics was propagating, the UK government had produced this Fernie Non-Intervention Pact. It was proposed by Baldwin. The Soviet Union had also signed this, but in a way, no one was following what they had signed. Two countries openly supported the Republic, the Mexican government and the USSR. The USSR sent volunteers, weapons and aircraft, machinery, vehicles. There are those who have, historians of the Spanish Civil War, who have argued that Stalin did not send enough arms. There are those who have criticized Stalin and the USSR in that they expected payment for the aircrafts and the weapons they sent. I'm not very sure. I'm not an expert in the area. I'm just repeating what I've read. It could be that not much, again, could have been done about this. But what was wrong was the way that Stalinist Russia supported the official Spanish Communist Party, which had become the defender of law and order under the slogan, first win the war, then make the revolution. They basically sabotaged the movement, the independent movement of more radical workers, peasants, and so on. And I don't think in that history, the Stalinists come out any good at all. That's one of the darkest periods of internationalism, if there was any internationalism, Stalin style. And in fact, the Soviet internationalism saw the low point of May 1937, where there was a fight between anarchists and the Stalinists for the control of the Barcelona telephone exchange. Again, I know there are different opinions even within our own comrades about this, but I think contradictions have to be resolved, but not in this manner. Soviet internationalism post-Stalin was no better. I mean, it got, you could almost say it got worse. So they supported anyone who moved maybe an inch from the United States or made an economic deal with one of the East European countries. They all became candidates for non-capitalist road for development. So we had the Shah in the mid-1970s, Khomeini in 1979. They were both candidates for non-capitalist road for development. And you can imagine the disillusionment that this creates for socialists globally. The Soviet-China competition, the fact that they called each other imperialist fascists, respectively, was another aspect of this bad period. So in this last section, I want to talk about what is not internationalism, and then right at the very end, talk about what is internationalism. And I would start by saying that supporting imperialist wars and imperialist aggression under whatever excuse, that the other side is backward, the other side is reactionary, the other side is underdeveloped and so on, is not internationalism. So if you look at the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, those such as Alliance for Workers' Liberty, who congratulated the victory of imperialism, are not internationalists. They are pro-imperialists. They are the Kautsky's of today. And we should not have any illusions about that kind of internationalism. We also can't call internationalists, in my opinion, those who support any reactionary state simply because it is shouting slogans against the West. In 1979 in Iran, as most of you know, not just the USSR and its brother parties, Tudeh and dozens of pro-Soviet communist parties, but also the Trotskyist left, who considered the Soviet Union a deformed state, and even some non-defenders of deformed worker states, such as Socialist Worker, were all amazed by the Iranian clerics and proudly, as Mike will tell you, came back to shout Allahu Akbar, God is great. Now, for anyone who thinks that Allahu Akbar is an internationalist slogan, they should go and really put their head in the sand, in my opinion. There is no justification. God is great has a meaning. Those who don't support God is great are being attacked. And we have to say that this ridiculous form of internationalism didn't die down. It continued at least until the 2010s. I would call it the internationalism of fools, the anti-imperialism of fools, whatever you want. For some of us, it was amazing. And I know this is a personal experience, but in a way it shows for others. So I came back from Iranian Kurdistan, where every night we were under helicopter gunships. I still can't sleep many nights because it's still in my head, helicopter gunships of the Islamic Republic trying to kill us, because this was the only place the left, the Iranian left, had managed to find some kind of safety. I came to London for a visit. I was going back, and every left-winger I met was saying, well, no, don't complain, Iran is anti-imperialist. And their internationalism was in solidarity with Iran. Iran has never been anti-imperialist. Khomeini never claimed to be anti-imperialist. Khamenei never claims to be anti-imperialist. They say they are against the arrogance of the West. And in many ways, as many authors have explained, there is an envy of the West that shows itself in opposition to the arrogance of the West. And to think that so many people died, a generation of communists died in the early 1980s in Iran. And people thought the Islamic Republic was, their act of international solidarity with Iran's Islamic Republic is just unbelievable. This continued itself in other forms of stupid slogans. We all went to demonstrations in London where one of the slogans was in defense of Palestinians, and I am well aware of the intervention of Hezbollah in South Lebanon. But the slogan was, we are all Hezbollah. No, comrades, we are not supporters of a neoliberal party in Lebanon, only because it is associated with a reactionary clerical regime that gives occasionally anti-Western slogans. And nowadays in Vienna, it's saying Americans are actually saying some very nice things. So don't be fooled by silly slogans. That is not serious internationalism. All these people who had illusions about the Islamic Republic became very confused during the Syrian war, because what I would consider to be tailing capitalist media, they almost overnight became more skeptical about Iran. Some became anti-Iran, probably because the media was telling them Iran is intervening in Syria and our wonderful Western democracies are in danger, or I'm not sure what. And this led to a situation where we don't hear, at least in Britain, we don't hear the kind of pro-Iran internationalism that we used to hear, but it's still there. It's okay. I think once the Syrian question is forgotten, because they never made any criticism of their positions in 1979, their position in the early 2000s, their positions up to 2010, 2007, the anti-war movement, where they didn't want to mention Iran. All of this means that they will forget about what they said this year, and in a couple of years, we'll have, again, defense of internationalist defense of the Islamic Republic. The other one that isn't internationalism is tailism of anything that moves. The Zapatistas in Mexico, Kurdish PKK, anybody that moves. I went to a seminar in Glasgow University a few years ago, and someone who shall be nameless was telling us that the Zapatistas have shown to us that walking in a park can be a revolutionary act. And we heard an hour in praise of this movement. And okay, this particular person had spent quite a bit of time with the Zapatistas, but in many cases, we have what I would call revolutionary tourists who are spending an hour a day, a couple of days with these movements, and are completely converted to their ideology. To that academic, I would say, no, revolutions are not dinner parties. Those of us who put our lives at risk, those of us who know what war against reactionary states mean, those of us who have slept under helicopter gunships, will not say walking in a park is a revolutionary act. If it was that simple, why did millions of socialists and communists in the 20th century and the 21st century gave up their lives? They gave up their lives because doing a revolution is far more serious, requires a lot more thought, a lot more work than the silly slogans you've learned in Mexico. There is also the Kurdish revolutionary tourists, in my opinion. They've all gone there. They've been there maybe a couple of days or a week or 10 days. And women are carrying guns. It shows there is no sex discrimination. Well, no, comrades. The Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, which is one of the most reactionary, misogynist organizations in the political groups, not the left, the political groups of Iran, allows women to carry guns. So that doesn't mean absolutely anything. If you think that's internationalism, then you are completely mistaken. But more importantly, these people went to the area in northern Syria, came back and told us the humanitarian airdrops by US plane, humanitarian bombing by US plane is defendable because that's what we heard in Syria. Well, no, comrades, there is no such a thing as humanitarian Western intervention. And those who support these kind of ideas are as bad as those who support the war efforts in the first place of Blair, Bush, Obama, and whoever else. The other one that isn't internationalism is solidarity with workers who support oppressive governments. And we heard this, I heard this in my great surprise in Scotland, where we were told again by the soft pro-imperialist organization, Workers' Liberty, that we should consider supporting Protestant workers in Northern Ireland, even if some of them were confused and supported UBF or the British Army. Well, no, I don't think that's true. We don't support. Workers can make mistakes. Workers can be fooled by nationalist leaders, by fascist leaders. there's no need for us to support them. That is my response also about Israeli workers who support a Zionist state, Israeli workers who benefit from the occupation of Palestinian lands are not people we show international solidarity with. We show international solidarity with the victims, with the oppressed. In the same way that Iranian workers who supported the Islamic Republic, fortunately their numbers are very few now, but in the early days of the Iranian Revolution, large sections of the Iranian working class did support Islamic fundamentalism. We don't support them. We expose them. That's not internationalism. So in the last minutes that I've wasted a lot saying what isn't internationalism, but I hope within those there was also some comments about what kind of internationalism we should espouse. And these are very basic ideas. I have no claims to say that I've just learned from the lessons of what shouldn't be internationalism. So I think we need to be informed, conscious, and aware of world situation if we want to be internationalists. We have to follow economic and political developments in global capital. We have to be constantly aware of the fightings within global capital, but also the ways they deal with the new contender, China. We must be aware of imperialist plans, and we should never show any mercy about such plans. We can't become apologists for imperialism, but we also shouldn't become apologists for reactionary governments. We should not be duped by human rights claims of imperialist countries. That whole industry, in my opinion, has been built with one aim. It was originally about the Cold War and the Soviet countries. It has now become Iran, Afghanistan. All of these, all the people who are involved in it are one way or another, most of the, I shouldn't say all, most of the people, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it, are financed by neoconservative, as far as the Middle East is concerned, pro-Zionist groups, individuals, organizations. We should have no illusions about international law. I see that even now, in terms of the Blair government, the discussion is what Corbyn concentrated on, I remember at the time, Corbyn and John McDonnell. Is this a legal war? An imperialist country is attacking a third world dictatorships that until recently was their main client with no justification. Who cares whether it's legal or not? Get a life, get out of this stupidity of looking at international law as if that determines anything of any significance. We should be fearlessly anti-war in general, because the wars of our time are imperialist wars. You can't see, I know there's a lot of talk about, for example, Iran attacking. Iran hasn't attacked any other country because it's well aware it would be smashed to smithereens if it did so. It does little acts here and there, but often in retaliation for something far bigger, like the bombing of most of its revolutionary guards in Syria, or bombing of bases of its revolutionary guards in Tehran. It is not in a position to do so. Turkey isn't in a position to do so. The wars we are seeing now are wars that imperialism needs, and that's why we have to be, generally speaking, anti-war. This would be part of our internationalism. We should be against nuclear weapons, all nuclear weapons, and in my opinion, and I will try and write more about it, but nowadays we should be against artificial intelligence weapons, which in the near future will probably become the more aggressive way capitalism will try and deal with opposition. So learning from the lessons that that I tried to summarize about the mistakes of internationalism, I think before falling into the trap of worshipping this or other latest trend in liberated areas, we should be aware of the politics that has led to that. We should be aware of the history of the organizations that form these. We should read their pamphlets with a critical eye, not with the eye of, well, whatever they say, they are fighting, so we must follow them. And in general, I think internationalism nowadays requires a lot more careful thinking, understanding political economy, understanding global capitalism, and following how this is affecting our class throughout the world. We can then decide what kind of international solidarity and how to express that international solidarity. Thank you very much. I'm finished.